English language A-level students, welcome aboard. Here's another video from me, Paul Heselton. This one is a very, very important one if you're wanting to revise for your English language A-level paper 2, language diversity. Because what we're going to do is we're going to go through what I think are the 23 most important concepts that you're going to need to learn for learning about identity and accent and dialect. So that's the focus of this particular video. It's getting you ready for your paper 2, your section A, possibly your section B as well, if the articles that you've got in your question 3 are about diversity. And who knows, maybe for your language investigation as well, because obviously you need AO2 concepts and theories in that as well. So it may well be that you've chosen a topic in which you're going to use some of these concepts. Here are some example questions that you would use the material from this video on to answer. Evaluate the idea that people's language usage is completely dependent on the social groups that they belong to. Evaluate the idea that the UK is losing its diversity in terms of regional accents and dialects. Evaluate the idea that people in the UK are judged by their accent. Write an opinion article, so this would be a question 4 on your section B. Write an opinion article about the importance of young people using standard English. So everything that we do, these 23 concepts, are going to be pretty crucial. Okay, so let's get started on concept number 1, which is Joanna Thornborrow. So Joanna Thornborrow is quoted quite early on in the chapter, the AQA textbook. I'm talking about this one. So quite early on in there in the language diversity section, and it's a good quotation that I get all of my students to memorise. One of the most fundamental ways we have of establishing our identity and of shaping other people's views of who we are is through the use of language. This is making a clear statement about the importance of language and identity. We project onto the world our identity. We may do it through the clothes that we wear, the house that we buy, the car that we buy, the hair that we have, if we're lucky enough to have any hair. And Joanna Thornborrow is saying, well, one of the principal ways they actually project our identity, consciously or maybe unconsciously, is through our use of language. Now, we may do this through lexical choices, so it may be the words that we use, like howe'er. It could be through grammatical constructions, like the double negative, I didn't see nothing. Or it may be variations in phonology. So I say bath, you say bath. One of the most fundamental ways we have of establishing our identity and of shaping other people's views of who we are is through the use of language. That's concept number 1. Now, concept number 2 is William Labov. So here, Martha's Vineyard. So Martha's Vineyard, an island off the Massachusetts coast in the US. And there he is, William Labov. And he's really a pioneering American sociolinguist. He was really the first person who was going off collecting data about sociolinguistics. And this is a 1960s study which really links language and perceived identity. So he goes to Martha's Vineyard, he notices that there's something quite distinctive about the way that the local fishing people are using language. And he also notices that middle-aged people, vineyarders, are using that same distinctive form. So he does lots of interviews, and what he notices is that those middle-aged vineyarders are basically converging with the local fishing people. And he looks principally at 2 phonological features, ow and I. These are 2 diphthong phonemes. These are 2 elided vowel sounds, ow and I. And so he noticed that these local middle-aged people are using these vowels in distinctive ways, and he thought that they did that in order to distance themselves from the accent features of the visiting, somewhat resented holiday tourists. Okay, so it's a really interesting pioneering study from the 1960s, and it also backs up some of Howard Giles' notions about accommodation theory, that we use language in order to converge with and diverge from other people. Now, of course, you're great A-level students, so you're not just going to be giving the information in your essays and your articles, but you're also going to be evaluating as well. So if you were evaluating this, you would need to draw attention to its age, the fact that we're back in the 1960s, so it's well over 50 years old. You'd also draw attention to its limited focus, that, you know, it is only looking at two very tiny accent features. And also you'd draw attention to its kind of unique location as well. And you'd be putting the question out there, well, to what extent are Labov's finding in Martha's Vineyard in the 1960s really relevant today? That's concept number 2, Labov's Martha's Vineyard study. Our third concept out of 23 is Jenny Cheshire's Reading study. Now, Jenny Cheshire is a British sociolinguist, and in the early 1980s she conducted a study in Reading, which is Berkshire, kind of 30 miles west of London, and she was interested in the language of school children in the playground and the grammatical variations in their speech. And again, she was particularly interested in gender, so she was interested in how the girls were communicating with each other and the boys, and the extent to which they were using standard or non-standard language. What she discovered was that boys tended to use more non-standard forms. So we're talking about things like ain't instead of isn't. We're talking about multiple negation, like I didn't do nothing. And we're talking about non-standard S inflection, like I goes to Reading. And these boys are using these non-standard forms, particularly if they perceive themselves to be members of gangs. So what Jenny Cheshire claims is that these sort of vernacular forms, these sort of street slang forms, are really attempts to create covert prestige. That means kind of hidden status in informal settings. So this is an interesting study. It provides some evidence that supports the difference gender viewpoint. But of course, again, you'd need to draw attention to the age of the study, that it is over 40 years old, and the fact that maybe it tells us quite a lot about Reading in the 1980s, but it's not necessarily representative of patterns in other contexts. So that's Jenny Cheshire's Reading study from 1982. William Labov is coming back for more. So this is his New York department store study. So this is, again, an old study in the 1960s and 70s. And this sociolinguistic study really looked at the link between pronunciation and social class. So for this one, Labov went round 3 department stores in New York which represented different class clientele, because there was Saks, which caters for sort of upper class consumers, Macy's, middle class, and Klein, lower class. And what he did was he asked questions to the shop workers in these 3 different stores, trying to elicit words that had the post-vocalic R phoneme. So that's the sound that you get in a word like car. That socially has high prestige, certainly on the east coast of the US. And so he was interested in whether these shop workers use this post-vocalic R phoneme in different ways. And lo and behold, he discovered that the higher the social class of the store's clientele, the more frequent the use of that prestige post-vocalic R phoneme. So this data seemed to confirm this idea that social class strongly impacts on people's phonology, at least in New York in the 1960s and 70s when he was doing his research. Now, there has been a more recent study in the 21st century to see whether this is data that stands the test of time, and one was done by somebody called Mather in 2013. And despite the fact that one of these stores by that time had closed down, it did confirm the same pattern. So it confirmed this idea that there is a strong correlation between people's social class and their language. But there were some changes that Mather detected as well. What he noticed was that the post-vocalic R was in fact more common in all stores. So he kind of assumed from that across New York and maybe across America the post-vocalic R has become more of a common feature. And he also made the point that ethnicity plays a part also in whether people use the post-vocalic R or not, because he noted that Afro-American heritage speakers tended to use that R less frequently. Concept number 4 is Labov's New York department store study. Right, we're now on to concept number 5 out of 23, and this is Peter Trudgill. Peter Trudgill is kind of the British William Labov. He did studies in the 1970s in East Anglia in Norwich. There's a lovely picture, isn't it? Lovely drawing of Peter Trudgill. And so he was looking at the possible linkage between people's language choices and their social class. And he found a very close correlation in his studies between social class and language. What he noticed was about the ing sound. Now, the ing sound on the end of a verb is called the velar nasal form, as in walking. And he noticed that the higher the social class, the more likely participants were to use the RP velar nasal form. So the middle classes are all saying walking, and according to his data, the lower classes are all saying walking. As in Labov's New York department store study, gender also plays quite an interesting social linguistic part, because what he noticed is that that females consistently use the RP form more often than males across all of those different social class gradations. And indeed, females also claimed that they were using RP more often than they actually did. So in the 1970s, Peter Trudgill is sort of representative of a group of linguists who are claiming that females tend to use the forms that have a more overt status, that they're more likely to be using received pronunciation and standard English in public discourse. Peter Trudgill also did another study in Norwich, this time on grammar, and on this one he looked at third-person present simple S inflections, like he live in Norwich, for example, as opposed to he lives in Norwich. And again, his results show a very clear relationship between participants' social class and use of standard English. Of course, by now you'll be used to me saying about evaluation and saying that these are very old studies, okay? And you'd want to make the point that social class is certainly one social linguistic variable, but there are literally dozens of other social linguistic variables as well that you'd need to take into account. Concept number 6 is BASA. This is Basil Bernstein's idea about codes. This was tremendously influential way back in the 1960s. He's making a linkage between language and class, and he's an educationalist, he's British, and he claimed that basically children's social class played a very, very important part in their overall educational achievement. And he used the concept of codes. He was basically arguing that working class language at home tends to be restricted code, very dialectical, and it seems to sort of disadvantage youngsters at school, because when students go to school they're expected obviously to understand and use a kind of middle class code. He called this elaborated code, and he argued that this had very far reaching consequences, not only on people's educational achievement but also on their sort of life chances as well. So this led to, in the 1960s, big movements and projects that were set up in order to try and bolster working class reading at home. Basil Bernstein was challenged at the time by William Labov. William Labov challenged Bernstein's kind of assumption that, a sort of prescriptive presumption really, that standard English is best. And what he did was he went off to the streets of New York and he interviewed lots of working class people. And he found that although these people were using vernacular forms, those vernacular forms were equally rich and subtle as standard English. So he kind of challenged this assumption that it's only really standard English that can be used in order to communicate elaborate ideas. So Concept number 6, Basil Bernstein's idea of codes. We're now leaping into more recent studies. So this is Emma Moore's Bolton study. Bolton is a town that is about 10 miles north of Manchester. So Emma Moore is a British sociolinguist, and she did a 2-year study of teenage girls' language in a secondary school. So a longitudinal study, gender-based, so only focused on female language. And what she did was she looked at a very specific area of non-standard usage. She looked at the primary auxiliary verb. So we have 3 primary auxiliary verbs, remember, in English: to be, to do, and to have. And so she was looking at the primary auxiliary verb to be when it's used in a standard or non-standard way. So I were joking is non-standard, whereas I was joking would be considered to be standard English. And what she was interested in is, which of the girls were using these non-standard or standard forms and how that linked into sort of group membership and communities of practice. She broke down the participants in her data into 4 different groups. Townies, these were girls who were considered to be rebels, involved in risky activities. I mean, these were associated with boys. I mean, how risky are you going to get? These were the group that were using the highest level of non-standard were. Then you had the populace, not as rebellious as the townies. They were inconsistent. So sometimes they use the standard form, sometimes they use the non-standard form. We then have the geeks, who are school-oriented, and what she noticed was that they unconsciously are tending to use the standard forms. And the biggest users of standard forms were the Eden Valley girls, who are very school-oriented, engaged in shopping and dance, and lived outside of Bolton, and they always used the standard form. So it's a really interesting study, a relatively recent study as well, that shows a sort of clear alignment between the standard or non-standard uses of language used by this particular community of practice and what it says about their identity. So, number 7, Emma Moore's Bolton study. Let's go into concept number 8. This is Rob Drummond from Manchester. So, Rob Drummond's Manchester ing study. A lot of linguists are absolutely obsessed with the velar nasal ing. So this is another study that's about this. It's about this inflectional ending that you put on the end of progressive aspect verbs. So in this 2010 study, Drummond interviewed a whole load of Polish heritage speakers, 40 of them, and when he analysed the data, he honed in particularly on inflectional ending, the ing. And what he found was that actually women were more likely to use the more non-RP ending than men, which sort of challenged previous research on gendered language that we had in the 1970s and 80s, which seems to suggest that females will always tend to use the kind of overtly higher prestige RP or standard forms. So that was an interesting finding, that women are actually, in this study, more likely to be using the more non-RP ending than men. And the study also revealed that those people she interviewed who were intending to return back to Poland were actually more likely to use this more non-RP sound. They were using a more kind of Polish consonant combination. So what Drummond concluded from that is that people's phonological choices are complicated. They are impacted by their immediate social context. So the females, because a lot of the females were working on the shop floor and interacting with local people, that for that reason they tended to be using the more non-RP form. But also the speaker's relationship with their native languages and their native country, original heritage native country, that also had an impact on the way that they were using language. So a really good demonstration of how complex the reasons behind people's accent features really are. So that's concept number 8, Drummond's Manchester ING study. We're now on to concept number 9, and we're going across the Irish Sea to Belfast. So this is a 1980s study by the Milroys, a linguistic combo, the Milroys, and they studied the language of working class communities in Belfast in Northern Ireland in the 1980s. And as you might expect, they found that people who lived and worked together in very tightly knit, closed communities tended to use more non-standard forms. So think of the docks, for example, where men are working together on heavy labour. These are the sorts of areas where you're going to get these tightly knit, closed communities. You're going to have quite distinctive non-standard forms. In terms of gender patterns, men who worked together tended to use these non-standard forms. However, in two Belfast communities, Hammer and Clonard, there was actually very high male unemployment. And what was interesting in Milroy's study there was that the female language tended to be more vernacular because it was the females who were going out to work, working in the factories. So they formed their close-knit, closed communities, and the men tended to be staying at home, looking after the children and doing other things. Okay, so it's an interesting study from the 1980s because it demonstrates the importance of social networks within a social class, and it shows that your perceived social community has a really important impact on whether you're using standard or non-standard English. So that's concept number 9, Milroy's Belfast study. We're now into, would you believe it, or would you Adam and Eve it, Cockney rhyming slang, as in dog and bone, meaning phone. So Cockney rhyming slang is a really good example of a kind of historical regional dialect that connects to people's sense of identity. Where did Cockney rhyming slang come from? Well, experts believe that it originated in the 1830s and the 1840s in East End London. And why were people doing it? Well, a lot of it was to do with street traders who were talking amongst themselves in marketplaces, and the Cockney rhyming slang allowed them to be talking in a confidential way so that the punters couldn't understand what they were saying. And of course, it was used in order to maintain a strong sense of community as well. Cockney rhyming slang. So our first instances of recordings of Cockney rhyming slang were in 1846, where the Oxford English Dictionary has Joanna for piano and Barnet, as in Barnet Fair, for hair in 1857. Has Cockney rhyming slang disappeared? Well, it's certainly diminished. It's changed in its features. And whilst you might say that rhyming slang is still one of these sort of bits of linguistic playfulness that people do, it's by no means confined to central London. But it's still a feature across the UK. Take, for example, Brittany. I'm just going to get some Britneys, as in I'm just going to get some beers, Britney Spears beers. So what this kind of rhyming slang, it's a kind of playfulness that requires schematic knowledge in the listener. So, if you've got the schematic knowledge and you understand the code, then that shows that you are part of the in-group crowd. So Cockney rhyming slang. We're now going to leap into one or two actual accents and dialects in the UK. So we're going to go up to the northeast of England, and Geordie is the Newcastle dialect, which has origins way back in Anglo-Saxon from 1500 years ago. So a lot of these strong dialects have very, very deep historical roots. And so if you hear people complaining about, Geordie, you could counter it by saying, well, actually, these are very old dialects which are being used. Okay, they have a very strong heritage which precedes standard English by many, many centuries. Examples of Geordie lexis and grammar would include things like gan for the verb go, bairn for the noun child, and hawe, meaning come on. Attitudes towards Geordie are interesting. In the textbook, I keep mentioning the textbook, it's this one. In the textbook, it refers to the Sittle study, a longitudinal study of 2,000 people across the country, asking them about their attitudes towards different regional accents. And the participants there found that Geordie was the friendliest in the UK, likely to put you in a good mood. So people like Geordie, apparently, according to this study. And Geordie also ranked highly in terms of trustworthiness and efficiency. So it's not just about friendliness, it's also about efficiency and effectiveness as well. And maybe the popularity of Geordie is the reason why, allegedly, so many companies have located call centres up in the northeast of England. Concept number 11 was Geordie. Now, concept number 12 is about lexical dialectical variations. This is the idea that the UK does contain such a wide variety of different regional lexical variations, and these result from a complicated fusion of invasion and immigration. When we're talking about invasion, we're talking about, in the older English periods, we've got the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes, who start arriving in the 5th century AD. So these are Germanic tribes that are bringing their different dialects across to the country, and this is the beginnings of English. Then in the late 8th century, you've got the Vikings from Scandinavia who are bringing Old Norse, and so that has a big impact on the emergence of different accents and dialects. And then, of course, you've got your Stormen Normans who start arriving in 1066, and so they impact very strongly on lexical dialectical variations. So the classic thing is to take one particular traditional concept and look at all the different synonyms that you've got in different areas of the country for that word. Take the concrete lexis bun. Yes, so the word bun has various synonyms depending on where you are in the country. If you're in the northeast, you could well be saying stotty. If you're in Yorkshire, you might be saying scuffler. If you're in the northwest, you might be saying barm cake, and if you're up in Scotland, you may well be saying softy. So there's no doubt that there is a great deal of lexical variation according to geographical area in terms of the words that people use, and there are certain semantic fields which famously demonstrate these strong areas of variation. So sports shoes, for example, and playground games like tig or tag, and all those various words that you get in various towns and cities for alleys, such as wind. So concept 12 is lexical dialectical variations. Concept 13 is grammatical dialectical variations. So again, we make the point that, these grammatical variations are partially a result of invasion and immigration. Examples of non-standard forms that you're going to be finding that are quite different to standard English would be using them as a demonstrative, as in pass me them books instead of pass me those books. So those are demonstratives. You've got ellipsis, which means the missing out of words. So the ellipsis of determiners, like we're going to shop. And then you've got pronoun variation as well. So where are yous? So the second person plural pronoun there is inflected with an S in order to show plurality. That's a really good example that you can use to show that actually some of these non-standard grammatical forms are more precise than the standard English forms. So you would sort of link this into prescriptive and descriptive approaches towards these forms of language. If you're a prescriptivist, presumably you're discouraging people from using these sort of non-standard forms because you're worried of mutual unintelligibility. Whereas a more descriptive approach, which is the sort of approach that we encourage in A-level, looks to basically identify, analyse, and maybe even celebrate this usage and show the linkage between the variation that you've got here is a really important component of people's identity. So concept 13 is grammatical dialect variation, and the third one of the trilogy is phonological regional variations. Again, immigration and invasion. have been important in producing a whole range of different accent features across the country. And a standard easy go-to example would be BATH, because if you're a northerner, then you are likely to be using a short vowel in that word, and if you're somewhere further to the south, you're more likely to be using a longer vowel. So accent features are complicated, however, because they're not just to do with where you live. There are a complicated mixture of social linguistic factors that make up people's accent features. Your regional background's important, but so is your ethnicity, your social class, as we've seen in previous studies, and your overall sense of identity. And what Howard Giles would argue from his accommodation theory is that accents, of course, are not fixed. Accents are dynamic, and so they can vary over time, and they can vary very much according to context, i.e. the formality of a situation. So that's concept 14, phonological regional variations. We're now on to the 15th concept out of 23, and this is about dialect levelling. This is very important. So what is dialect levelling? Well, there's your definition. It's the process by which language forms of different parts of the country converge and become more similar. And this process leads to a kind of loss of distinctive regional features and reduced diversity of language. So the idea is that language is becoming more and more homogeneous across the country. Leslie Milroy, this is the same person who was involved in the Belfast study that we looked at before, they argue that increased geographical mobility has resulted in this large-scale disruption of close-knit localised networks that have historically maintained systematic and complex sets of linguistic norms. So people are moving around a lot more, and that's meant that dialect levelling has resulted. Paul Kurzweil, he's the other expert on dialect levelling. He links dialect levelling to the reduction of rural employment, so fewer people working in farms, the development of suburbs, certainly the growth in social mobility, and of course you've got increased interaction with people of other speech varieties. All of these things have led to a trend that is argued of dialect levelling. Concept number 16 is linked to dialect levelling, however, and this is a linguistic duo called Folkes and Doherty, and they look at TH fronting. So TH fronting would be saying north instead of north. Okay, so they noted that there are actually some significant dialect survivors, i.e. linguistic forms, which seem to resist this pattern of levelling. So free instead of three, that's an example of TH fronting, and that's a feature which appears to have spread north and west way beyond its original London location. You might argue that this spread of the kind of non-RP version, free instead of three, is in itself a kind of levelling. Concept 16, Folkes and Doherty. Concept 17, MLE, Multicultural London English. So the three big linguists' names you need to remember on this are Jenny Cheshire, she of the Reading study, Paul Kurzweil, who I've just mentioned about dialect levelling, and Sue Fox. And they worked together and they identified features of a new dialect called MLE, Multicultural London English, which emerges in London in the early 21st century and very different from the sort of traditional Cockney sound of London. So this dialect form, it's been described as a kind of multi-ethnolect because it reflects linguistic influences from the Caribbean, West Africa, Southeast Asia. But it's complicated, and the kinds of people who are using multicultural London English vary, including white, English heritage, working class London speakers. So it's not like, you know, your main MLE speakers are people of a Caribbean heritage exclusively. This is a multi-ethnolect that kind of reflects the exciting combination of different heritage backgrounds across London. So some features would include th stopping, so dem instead of them. You also have some borrowed lexis, so instead of men you have man dem, with the dem there, quite interesting, being used as a kind of plural inflection. And then you've got non-variant tag questions, so instead of we've arrived, haven't we, it's got we've arrived, yeah. So th stopping, borrowed lexis, non-variant tag questions are sort of easy go-to things to remember about multicultural London English. In the textbook, we have Gary Ives' South London study, which concluded actually that teenagers' language was less about ethnicity and more about where people lived immediately. And of course, there has been various articles in the media in the past which have sort of dismissed MLE. We have some prescriptive commentators that have labelled it stupidly as Jafaken, somehow kind of imagining that when people are using language in this way, they're not being authentic in some way. So a good example of sort of prescriptive viewpoint towards language. Concept 18 is Gary Ives' Bradford study. So we mentioned Gary Ives in the previous study. So we're up here in West Yorkshire. So he commissioned a 2014 case study of Bradford teenagers' language, and he was particularly interested in students with a Pakistani heritage. And the report was really interesting because what it shows is a really complicated mixture of influences on teenage language. It's not just people's heritage, i.e., I come from this certain part of Pakistan and that's why I'm using language like that. Language is much more complicated. There are other factors such as how long have you been in the UK? Are you a freshie, for example, like you've only been in the country a few months, or are you more established? Whereabouts in Bradford do you live? Are you in BD8 or are you in the posher BD22? So your postcode is important, and obviously things like your favourite music that you listen to. So the study is interesting because it shows that there is such a complicated mixture of influences on teenage language. And the study focuses well also on code switching, where these respondents are shifting between different languages while talking, sometimes to exclude those without schematic knowledge. Code switching. Gary Ives Bradford Studies, Concept 18. We now go to Concept 19. This is about attitudes towards regional accents. Okay, there is a quotation from the British sociolinguist Peter Trudgill in the textbook that argues that accent and dialect prejudices are alive and kicking and remain deeply embedded in the UK. And what he claims is that RP speakers can often be assumed to be sort of haughty and unfriendly by non-RP speakers. So there's a kind of inverted prejudice going on there. But he also says that non-RP speakers continue to be dismissed as having less educational potential than those with middle-class accents and dialects, which of course he says is far more worrying. That is a quotation that is from the 1990s. I'd be interested to know whether people feel that these accent and dialect prejudices are as deeply ingrained now as they were in the 1990s. Certainly the media is still awash with all sorts of articles and polls about the popularity of different UK accents. We have in the textbook mentioned the BBC Voices survey, which identified a really close linkage between supposed pleasantness and prestige. For example, the popularity of the Edinburgh accent and dialect over the Brummie accent and dialect. There is mention also of a Daily Telegraph poll which identified Queen's English, presumably RP, Scottish and Geordie as the coolest accents, while Liverpudlian, West Country and Birmingham were adjudged to be least cool. So you might want to think about, the reasons behind that. Is this aesthetic and people are just responding purely to the sound of the accent? or is it to do with the kind of like the cultural connotations that people have with different regions? Concept 20 is Howard Giles and his matched-guise studies. Now, it makes the point in the textbook that Howard Giles didn't originate the original matched-guise studies because there's somebody in Canada in the 1960s who's mentioned as doing that. But here he is in the 1970s, this British sociolinguist Howard Giles, and he's using these matched-guise studies involving participants who are basically listening to the same speaker, delivering the same script with the same intonation and the same body language, but one time they're doing it in RP and the other time they're doing it in a regional accent, in this case in a Birmingham accent. So that's a matched-guise study where you strip away all of the other possible variables and the only thing that you're changing are people's accents. So he did various studies in the 1970s, and the ones that you get mentioned in textbooks are the two studies which involved a single speaker putting forward arguments about psychology and also about capital punishment, and those speeches were delivered to groups of teenagers. And what he found was that these teenage listeners rated the RP speaker higher in terms of competence and intelligence. But on the other hand, they were more likely actually to have changed their minds after listening to the regional accent speaker, the Birmingham speaker. So RP scores high in terms of people's perceptions of competence and intelligence, but in terms of persuasiveness, regional accents, if this study is to believe, pack a punch. So that's Howard Giles' matched-guise studies. Obviously, again, you're still going to be evaluating. You're going to be saying, well, this is a study that is from 50 years ago, and it may tell us a lot about the perceptions of RP and Birmingham accent then, but, those are only two accents. So it may not be truly representative of people's perceptions of other accents across the country. Here is another study which is about attitudes to accent. We have Dixon, Mahoney and Cox. It's a matched-guise study. This is a really interesting one because it's about the correlation between accent and perceived guilt. So participants who watched videos of police questioning were more likely to perceive the Birmingham accent speaker to be guilty than the RP speaker, despite the fact that the actor was delivering lines from identical scripts. So, interesting example of accent bias. Evaluate. It's a good study. It's a more recent study than some of the Howard Giles' ones. But again, you'd say attitudes towards the Birmingham accent are not necessarily representative of wider accent bias. There were 119 participants of this. They were all white undergraduates and the vast majority were female. So you might argue that the lack of participant diversity could have impacted on the results. Concept 21, Dixon, Mahoney and Cox matched-guise study. We're now on to the penultimate study. This is number 22, Newlop and Spetton Hansen. This is an American study that's about ethnocentrism. So Newlop and Spetton Hansen, they did an American matched-guise study in 2013 which researched attitudes from an ethnocentric viewpoint. Now, what is an ethnocentric viewpoint? Well, ethnocentricity can be defined as when people perceive their culture to be superior to others. So if you're ethnocentric, you value your own culture and you think it's better than other people's cultures. The study concluded that responses towards non-native speakers of English often depended on the ethnocentricity of the listener. And those participants who were judged to be heavily ethnocentric tended to rate non-native speakers as less attractive and less credible. So a good example of accent bias, but American. So, is this relevant when we're discussing accent bias in the UK? We're now on to the very final diversity topic. This is about teacher accent and bias, and these are a couple of old studies which are mentioned in the textbook about accent bias. We have a Canadian study from 1972 by Seligman, Tucker and Lambert, and their study claimed that teachers' perceptions of students were really heavily influenced by their speech. Yes, their accent, but also to do with their level of standard or non-standard English. So there's a non-UK study from the early 1970s. And we also have another study, also from the 1970s, this time from Hawaii, and Choi and Dodd. And they concluded that teachers make judgments on ability and personality based on the way that students speak. Obviously, you'd need to evaluate these if you're mentioning them. You'd need to mention that both of them are non-UK. And of course, they're both over 50 years old. Well, that concludes all of the accent, dialect, standard, non-standard English bits of research that I would be learning for the Paper 2 Section A and Section B questions. In other videos we're going to be climbing into, we'll do a single video that's about language and occupation, we'll do a single one that's about language and gender, and we'll do one about age and sexuality as well. But we're going to leave that one for the time being. Thank you very much. Good luck with your studies.